All right. Morning, Roadrunners. A couple of things. I posted the exam 4 topics list for you this morning. It's ready to go. You've gotten emails probably over the weekend about a course evaluation survey. I'd really like for you to take a few minutes and do those. It's important to the university. It's important to me as well. You can praise me, you can damn me. I don't care which. Just do the survey, please. Don't know how far we're going to get today, but we will give it a try. I'm going to, since I'm getting burnt out, I know you're getting burnt out. So we're going to play pretty close to the script here today. We're not going to get off track too much. So it's going to be pretty much down to the bare essentials. Understood? All right, well, let's get started then. Escalation and Americanization. What starts off as a civil war between the government of South Vietnam and an insurgent group known as the Viet Cong very quickly expands and escalates into an American war. President Johnson is going to continue the policies of his predecessors. Johnson now becomes the 4th American president to have to deal with this situation in Vietnam. Now, Johnson's an interesting character in that he comes into the office with very little foreign policy experience. He'd been in Congress most of his life, but he had always focused on domestic policy. And his Great Society program that you've read about is the evidence of that. Now, this Great Society program, he is afraid that Vietnam and what he's going to have to do there is going to distract the public's attention from his Great Society, from his war on poverty, from his civil rights issues. So he pledges to continue supporting the policies that Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy had already set in place. In other words, containment. Now, the other problem that Johnson faces is that he's a liberal Democrat, more so than even Kennedy. So Johnson, like Kennedy, feels that he must prove his anti-communist credentials, or else he'll be labeled soft on communism, which would be a political damage. So he's going to try to do what he can to make sure that Vietnam remains an independent, non-communist country. So I got Johnson here in his own words for you. Did you get that? Did you hear that? What's he talking about there? Domino theory, exactly. He buys into it just like everybody else does. So a variety of solutions are going to be attempted. We're going to spend more money. He's going to send over more advisors. He's going to pressure the South Vietnamese government to make reforms, to eliminate the corruption, but the instability continues. The situation really doesn't change much for the better. When Kennedy leaves, or when Kennedy's assassinated, we're now spending about $1 million a month on Vietnam. Whatever Johnson does, whatever the United States does, nothing seems to work. As we apply more pressure, as we put more troops or more advisors in, as we give the South Vietnamese government more military assistance, the Viet Cong continue to get stronger. They start stepping up their attacks. Attacks become much more frequent now. And they start targeting Americans as well as South Vietnamese targets. There's going to be several coup attempts. A coup is a government overthrow. And a couple of them are going to be successful. Mostly a couple of generals are going to take over the government, and then they're going to be overthrown by another set of generals a little bit later on. So there's constant turmoil in the South Vietnamese government. Nobody is really staying in power long enough to make any reforms that the United States is asking. Now, Johnson is going to be hesitant to get directly involved. By mid-1964, his advisors are telling him that the situation is rapidly deteriorating, more rapidly than it had before. and that South Vietnam will fall to a communist Viet Cong rebellion if the United States does not take a more active role. But Johnson, again, hesitant to get directly involved, partially due to this idea we just mentioned that it'll distract from the Great Society, but also because if he sends in troops necessary, the number of troops necessary to probably deal with this, it's going to look like an American invasion. And that would be bad public relations. It would be bad publicity. And so he's hesitant to do what needs to be done. Plus, he doesn't want to be the one to throw the first punch. He wants to be able to have an excuse or a justification for greater involvement. And that justification comes in August of 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, August of 1964, is the door opening for a greater American involvement here in the war. Now, what's happening is that the Viet Cong, let's go to the map here, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese are using these trails running through Laos and Cambodia, known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, to invade and take supplies down to the south. And so the South Vietnamese government is very hard-pressed to stop this. Johnson orders the USS Maddox, an American naval vessel, to sit 10 miles off the coast of North Vietnam, right above the 17th parallel, right about here where the mouse pointer's at. Now, 10 miles off the coast, keep that in mind. The Maddox is sitting here. Its mission is to listen to the radio transmissions, the signals, radio signals, eavesdrop on the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, report that intelligence back to the South Vietnamese army so that they can take action, meet the Viet Cong where they're coming in. As the Maddox is sitting out there on August 3rd, it's approached by two North Vietnamese patrol boats. These two patrol boats fire torpedoes at the Maddox, sitting 10 miles off the coast. It doesn't hurt the Maddox at all. In fact, they miss wildly. The Maddox, the commander of the Maddox, has standing orders, as do all American naval officers: protect your ship first and then ask questions later. So the captain of the Maddox returns fire, sinks both of these boats, and then reports to his superiors in Pearl Harbor that he had been under attack. That message then goes to the Pentagon. That message then goes to the White House. Johnson gets this message, and he lets out a string of cuss words from here to San Marcos. One of Johnson's character traits is that he was a colorful and artistic curser. He raised cursing to an art form. He was a pretty crude fellow. But he was livid that this attack had taken place. So the next day, he orders the Maddox to resume that same position for the same mission, hoping, again, to provoke an attack. The attack never comes the second day. The commander of the Maddox radios that the bad weather, they never had a confirmed sighting that they were under attack, and so he has to assume that he was not. That message goes to Pearl Harbor, it goes to the Pentagon, it goes to the White House. Johnson gets it, he reads it, he lets out another string of cuss words from here to San Marcos. He wads up that second message and throws it away. The following day, he takes the first message, the confirmed attack, he goes to Congress and asks for permission to retaliate. This is what's known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution gives the president the authority to retaliate. Keep in mind, only Congress can declare war. He's not asking Congress for a declaration of war. He's simply asking for permission to use American military forces to retaliate. And overwhelmingly, the Congress approves the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Public opinion polls taken in 1964 here in the U.S. show that at least 75% of the American public is fully on board with this decision. Now, I keep emphasizing 10 miles off the coast because that in itself is problematic. At this time, the United States and many other nations only recognized a 3-mile coastal boundary. North Vietnam and many other nations, and we fully knew North Vietnam recognized a 12-mile national boundary. And Johnson knew that. That's why he put the Maddox at 10 miles, so he could claim that the Maddox was in international waters and that this attack was an act of war. When in fact, from the North Vietnamese perspective, this was an invasion of their coastal territory. And Johnson knew this. All of this gets recorded. None of it comes out at the time, though. It doesn't come out until 1971 when the Pentagon Papers are published that showed how Johnson had lied to the American public during this episode. Now, after the episode, Johnson orders a series of retaliatory attacks. And this marks the beginning of a direct American involvement. And he's going to now break the original containment policy by sending American troops in. American combat troops will arrive in South Vietnam in March of 1965. After a series of Viet Cong attacks targeting Americans and American positions in South Vietnam, Johnson orders 3,500 Marines to be deployed to South Vietnam to protect American lives and property. These are the first combat troops that the United States has sent. So this breaks the original containment policy. Remember, Truman said, we'll send you money, we'll send you weapons, we'll send you supplies, but you've got to do the fighting for yourself. Well, this is the first example of the United States starting to take over an active role fighting the Viet Cong. And I'll give you this. I've got a video here to show you this. This is called Troops Landing. Okay, 3,500 troops sent in that initial wave. Not part of a bigger plan for more troops. In fact, what you're going to see here is this gradual escalation, troops being sent in 10,000 at a time over the next year. So that by the end of 1965, there's 200,000 troops in South Vietnam in active combat roles. Now this is characteristic of what's happening here in 65 that will happen through 66, 67, and 68 as well. We make the mistake, the near fatal mistake, that only a light show of force will be necessary. When Johnson and his advisors sent in that first 3,500 Marines, they thought that's all it would take. A light show of force and the Viet Cong would crumble. So they clearly underestimated their enemy here. And as we continue to go through this period, it's going to get in the situation where he's got to send even more troops in. There we go. Now this gradual escalation then, between 65 and 68, additional troop deployments will be deemed necessary. North Vietnam now becomes more actively involved, deploying their army as well to back up the Viet Cong. By 1968, we've reached that massive American buildup of 550,000 combat troops. Over 500,000 troops are now in country. And every step of the way, we believe that this is going to be enough. but it's not, and so we send more. This gradual escalation, Johnson sends troops in, kind of in, if you will, kind of in a bell curve like this. Each year, each month, a few more troops. Despite a takeover, things still don't change. Despite a U.S. takeover of the war effort, the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese army, continue fighting. This now becomes a war of attrition, meaning we wait for them to kill us so that we can kill them. And then the only measure of success that we have here is either waiting for the enemy to give up, which they never do, or using that flawed policy of the body count that we had discussed the other day. American casualties start to rise, and the war begins losing public support as it drags on with little success. Polls now by late 67 show only about 60% of Americans fully approve of our actions in Vietnam. Another 25% would like to see us get out, but are not willing to cut and run, meaning withdraw immediately. And so Johnson is losing the public support for this war. The anti-war movement starts growing as American casualties rise and no progress is being made. The turning point to get us out then will be the Tet Offensive of 1968. Tet is the Lunar New Year. It occurs during the last week of January. To the Vietnamese, well, to us, in comparison to Tet, it'd be like taking Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter, 4th of July, which we're off Wednesday, by the way, St. Patrick's Day, Fiesta, Mardi Gras, Super Bowl Sunday, rolling them all up into one great big party. That's Tet. And every year, since the United States' first initial involvement in 1950, during Tet, there's been an unofficial ceasefire. There's no treaty, there's nothing signed, there was no agreements. It's just everybody had something better to do during the last week of January than kill each other. So there was this informal truce. Now, here in 1968, military intelligence picks up information that the Viet Cong are planning an attack during Tet. And they say this is probably going to be a massive attack. Johnson and his political advisors, his civilian advisors, ignored the advice of his military and his intelligence agencies and ordered the troops to stand down. Even General Westmoreland, the commander-in-chief of American forces in South Vietnam, says that, has told his troops to stand down, but to be ready just in case. Now I've got a video here for you. This is going to be called Before Tet, or excuse me, Making Progress rather. This is General Westmoreland and then General Wheeler. That's not the right one. There we go. That's the one I want. What happens here is that our military officials, being directed by their civilian leaders, are telling the American public that we're winning this war, that we're making tremendous progress here. This is what, again, when you only have a handful of news sources, this is the news that the American public is getting, even though the evidence seems to be contrary. that despite 500,000 troops, the Viet Cong are not getting any weaker. So here, the Tet Offensive of 1968 occurs. Watch this. And the United States Embassy. My video editing skills suck, I know. I cut that part off. And the American Embassy in Saigon. Now, if we had been listening to our leaders, as we were, and if they were correct, the Tet Offensive should never have been possible. If the Viet Cong were as weak and ready to quit as our leaders had told us, this would never have happened. On January 30th, a highly coordinated attack. An estimated 80,000 Viet Cong troops attack over 100 targets all across South Vietnam, all at the same moment. This video shows it happening in sequence, but that's not correct. It happens all at once in all of those places. This is highly coordinated that required a great deal of planning. Here, military intelligence was not an oxymoron. The intelligence community was correct. The other thing that's happening here is that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese are now bringing the fight to us. We had been taking the fight to them out in the rice fields and in the jungles, as the narrator had said, for most of this time. We thought we controlled the cities. We thought we were safe in the cities. The Tet Offensive clearly shows that nowhere in Vietnam is under American control. There is simply no place where the American troops are in complete control. Now, I'm going to show you this again, and I want you to note how the narrator talks about Johnson needing public support, and then watch how it develops across this map. This happens all at once. Boom. And the American Embassy. In fact, they captured the American Embassy and held it hostage for about a day. Now, to the credit of American troops, almost all of these attacks were immediately repelled. They held the embassy for about a day before they were wiped out. Almost all of the other ones, they were met and wiped out during the attack. The battle for Hue, the provincial capital way up in the northern part of South Vietnam, right at the 17th parallel, goes on for about a week. If you've ever seen the movie Full Metal Jacket, that most of the action in the second part of that movie is the Battle of Hue. Now, this is completely devastating to American morale. It proves to the American public either that our leaders are incompetent, or they're lying to us, or perhaps both. And public opinion starts to slip even faster now. The Tet Offensive is going to be that doorway that starts to get us out. Now, you have to understand that the Tet Offensive was a military defeat for the Viet Cong. They did not win. Their goal was to stage this huge uprising to get the South Vietnamese people on their side to rise up against American troops and throw the American troops out. That never happened. So it was a military failure on the Viet Cong. That, and they all got killed. What it was, though, what it represents is a huge psychological victory for them, though, because it proved that they were still in the fight, that they were still capable of causing great problems here for the United States. Public support now starts to erode at this alarming speed. By mid-68, public opinion polls here in the U.S. show that less than half of Americans now support the war. The anti-war movement now gains legitimacy. Rather than being just an outside group of radicals and hippies and pot smokers, now it becomes a much broader cross-section of the American public. Ministers, doctors, college professors, housewives, businessmen, all now start to think that our involvement in Vietnam is a mistake, and support for the war starts to erode very rapidly. This is also going to have some domestic political consequences. 1968 is an election year, and Johnson wants to run for re-election. The Tet Offensive occurs in late January of 1968. The first Democratic primary election is February of 68, about 2 weeks later. Johnson wins the primary, but only by a small margin. His main competitor is a senator named Eugene McCarthy, no relation to Joseph, who was what we call a dove. He was an anti-war candidate. His entire platform says, you elect me president, I will immediately withdraw us from Vietnam. Now, that's a pretty radical solution to start with. Secondly, it's very rare for a sitting president to have a challenger within his own party. For instance, in 2020, Donald Trump is probably not going to have a Republican challenger, or a serious Republican challenger. It just doesn't work that way. On this time, though, Johnson had serious. He had at least 3 serious competitors, and when one of them almost beat him in the New Hampshire primary, Johnson knows that if he continues to run, it's going to tear the country even further apart. So Johnson withdraws from the race. He goes on television and says that he's not going to seek a second term. So this has domestic political consequences as well. There it is. So tell me this. The 1968 Tet Offensive did which of the following? Okay. Whoops. No. 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 Results. The group says D is correct. The group is correct. Very good. This brings us to a decent interval. An explanation of this slide title will be coming shortly. After the Tet Offensive, and as 1968 rolls around, things become very, very bad. This is the long, hot summers, and the civil rights movement is becoming much more radical. The anti-war movement is becoming much more radical as well. Now, since Johnson is out, he's got a couple of competitors. Eugene McCarthy is still in. Robert Kennedy, the former president's brother, is the leading contender, but he's assassinated in July of '68 after winning the California primary and almost therefore assuring that he would have been the presidential nominee. This leaves us now with Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's vice president, who says he's going to continue to do what Johnson did, which is about the least popular thing that he could have said. But Humphrey was not going to take any risks. So the Republicans, in the meantime, believe that they have a victory in hand. And LBJ's war now becomes Nixon's war. Nixon, the Republican candidate, wins a huge victory in the 1968 election, partly because this is a rejection of the Democrats and their policies, not only the Vietnam War policy, but also parts of his Great Society program, and partly because the public, though disillusioned, still doesn't want to cut and run. Nixon hints that he has, quote, a secret plan to end the war. People ask him, of course, Mr. Nixon, what's your plan? He says, shh, can't tell you, it's a secret. In reality, much like FDR, Nixon probably didn't have much of a clue on what to do here. Nixon's now the 5th American president to have to deal with Vietnam. And he knows that this war is the single most divisive and distracting issue in the country at the time. Plus, Nixon would rather focus on superpower relations, dealing with the Soviet Union and the People's Republic. He sees Vietnam as a distraction, and he sees that how badly it's tearing up American society, and he sees that how badly it's damaging our credibility with our allies. So he hints that he has a secret plan. He promises then to end the war, quote, with honor. He says, we're not going to abandon our ally, we're not going to run, but we will begin transitioning the burden of the fighting back to the South Vietnamese government. It's a policy that's known as the Nixon Doctrine, or Vietnamization. Here, Nixon wants to return responsibility back to the South Vietnamese government for combat operations. He's going to say, we'll send you money, we'll send you weapons, we'll send you supplies, but you're going to have to start doing more and more of the fighting for yourself. In other words, the Nixon Doctrine is an attempt to get us back to the original Truman Doctrine that Johnson had broken. Now, Nixon knows that he can't do this immediately. Johnson sent troops in at a level about like this. Nixon will start removing American troops at about the same rate that Johnson put them in, only it's going to take him 4 years to do so. Nixon's critics say that he took way too long here, that he could have had more success withdrawing American troops and ending American involvement had he just moved a little quicker. But Nixon insists that it's going to take this long to get the Vietnamese government ready to go, ready to take over the burden of the fighting. Nixon also changes the goal of the war. Under Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, the goal had been a military defeat of the Viet Cong. We would do everything we can to support them, the South Vietnamese, in their battle against the Viet Cong, to the point of taking over combat operations and assuming the majority of the responsibility for the war. Nixon is going to change the goal and say we don't need a complete victory. because it's clear, it's obvious that the Viet Cong are much stronger than we had estimated, evidenced by the Tet Offensive, and they've never shown any desire or any inclination to surrender, to end the war themselves. So Nixon simply changes the goal to a negotiated settlement based on the status quo of 1968. Negotiate a settlement that will remove American troops, return American prisoners of war. In return, we have to recognize the Viet Cong as a legitimate political party, and we have to accept that North Vietnam is going to supply the Viet Cong just like we're supplying the South Vietnamese. So this goes on, these negotiations go on now for 4 years. As the negotiations goes on, Johnson gradually withdraws American troops. It looks like he's living up to his promise. This peace talks resume in earnest, but he says any settlement that we come up with must not, underlined, must not look like an American defeat. He says we will end this war with honor. And so he begins these gradual troop withdrawals, but at the same time he widens the war. As Nixon is pulling American combat troops out, he's intensifying the bombing campaign in the north. Now this is where it gets tricky. And this is where we have some problems trying to understand this conflict. It's not total war, it's a limited war. And there was never the option discussed, seriously discussed, of invading North Vietnam. Because remember what happened the last time we invaded a communist country on China's southern border, Korea. The Chinese got involved and we almost got our butts kicked. There was a fear that if we ever invaded North Vietnam, that the Soviets, or at least the Chinese, would get involved, and this could easily slip into World War III. So invading North Vietnam was never on the table. However, and this is the crazy part that I don't fully understand, we conducted an air war against North Vietnam since the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Since 1964, we were almost continually bombing targets in North Vietnam. Now this was justified as necessary to limit their industrial and their transportation capacities. However, North Vietnam was kind of like North Korea is today. It's pretty backward technologically. It didn't have a whole lot of industry. And so what we ended up doing was basically bombing what we'd already bombed a year before. And we just keep doing that over and over and over. It had very little effect. The other justification was psychological, that we're going to bomb the North Vietnamese into submission. They're going to see what terrible toll American bombers are taking on their country, and they will beg for negotiations. Well, that never happened either. And so, at the same time, while Nixon is taking out American combat troops, looks like he's winding the war down, he's also at the same time winding up the air war against North Vietnam. So this is one of the contradictions of our policy here. Nixon has to make it look like he's doing something. He's got to satisfy the public that he's doing something positive, at the same time not making it look like an American withdrawal. Two events are going to happen in 1970 then, back to back. That caused the anti-war movement to gain even greater strength and turn the American public even further against the war. And that's the invasion of Cambodia and the demonstrations at Kent State University. Back to the map. Cambodia technically is neutral, and nobody, us or them, are supposed to be using Cambodia. However, the Viet Cong are using Cambodia as a safe haven. This is part of those rules of engagement that we discussed the other day. The Viet Cong have camps set up and fortresses set up all along the border, secret supply bases where they're stockpiling weapons that they filter into the south. American troops know about this, but every time we chase them, our troops have to stop at the border, so the bad guys keep getting away. Nixon decides that this is an untenable situation, so he orders a deep, deep black ops mission, super secret mission, to invade using highly trained American special forces, small numbers of special forces, to invade, attack these supply bases, wipe them out, destroy the infrastructure here that the Viet Cong were using. The South Vietnamese army is going to also accompany this invasion as well. Now, the problem with this, first, it was successful. It worked. It wiped out these bases and wiped out the infrastructure and severely weakened the North Vietnamese ability to supply the Viet Cong. The problem, it didn't stay secret. News gets out. And when news gets out, anti-war protests erupt all across the country. This ties in, this is April of 1970. So while it looks like, again, Nixon is trying to pull us out of the war, the perception now is that he's widening the war. Instead of getting us out of South Vietnam, he's getting us deeper in South Vietnam, and he's taking us into Cambodia. Now, this raid was only a one-off mission. It was only supposed to happen once. It was not part of a larger plan to bring American troops into Cambodia. We also stepped up our air raids in Cambodia as well, which again is technically an act of war. We're attacking a neutral country here. Now, these anti-war riots that erupt all over the country, one of them is at Kent State University in Ohio. Now, what's going to happen here is there's going to be a riot. The students at Kent State were protesting, but they attracted a lot of, well, let's say hardcore radicals from the more radicalized elements of the anti-war movement. And so it was a mixture of both Kent State students and outsiders. Now, the outsiders were much more radical. Kent State was actually a pretty conservative university. The National Guard was called out to maintain order after some of these probably outside radicals burned down the ROTC building on campus in protest of the war. Now this has crossed the line. This is no longer civil disobedience. This is no longer justifiable civil protest. This is the destruction of property. This is a crime. This is revolution. And so the governor calls the National Guard out to restore order. To break up the crowds, the troops are firing cans of tear gas into the crowds. Some of the protesters are picking up the cans of tear gas and throwing them back at the troops, throwing rocks and bricks at the troops. So the troops making their way through the crowd get cut off from the rest of the troops. One small group gets cut off from the rest of the troops. Now, we don't know exactly what happened next, whether the order to fire was given or not, or if it was an accident, but somebody fired a shot, and pretty soon everybody fired a shot. The result is 5 students lay dead on the ground with another 8 severely injured. This is carried live on TV. And so when the American public sees these images, they turn against the war even further. Now it's come and it's killing American students here in the United States, is at least the perception. Were the guardsmen justified? Well, they were not well trained in riot control, for one thing. And secondly, they were mostly about the same age, very young, inexperienced troops, about the same age as the college students. So they were probably poorly led as well. So they probably weren't the best tool to use to try to break up this demonstration. The anti-war movement intensifies. By 1971, 6 months after Kent State, about 70% of Americans thought the war was a mistake to begin with, and almost 50% thought that the United States should withdraw regardless of the consequences. And so even Nixon, who's trying to bring back and trying to gain public support, is now losing it even faster, events that are out of his control. (1971) continues, American troop withdrawals continue, American bombing of the North and Cambodia continue, the anti-war movement continues. 1972 is an election year, and Nixon badly wants to be reelected. He's one of these guys that needs almost constant public confirmation that he's right. And so he thinks that he needs an even bigger victory in 72 than he had in 68 as a confirmation of his policies and of himself. Right before the elections, about a month before the elections, his National Security Counselor, Henry Kissinger, holds a press conference and says, "Peace is at hand." He says that we've reached an agreement in principle with the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese to end the war on American terms. As a result, Nixon goes on to win a huge landslide victory, one of the biggest victories up to that date. The problem is that as soon as Kissinger has said this and Nixon has won the election, the Viet Cong try to pull out of the agreement. Nixon then increases the bombing campaigns, threatens to restart resending American troops back to Vietnam. Finally, by May of 1973, the two sides have reached an agreement. The United States finally ends the war in 1973, May of 73, when the last American combat troops are withdrawn. Now the war is going to continue. It's just going to continue without us. When we left the South Vietnamese government virtually all of our military equipment that we had brought over. 1973, South Vietnam, little tiny South Vietnam, had the world's fourth largest air force. That was because it was ours. Then we gave it to them. Even now, on their own, with American assistance, continued military assistance, continued financial assistance, a series of South Vietnamese governments still can't put down the Viet Cong rebellion. Now, what did we get out of this? Well, it allowed for the American troops to withdraw. So the American active role in the war is over. We got our POWs back. Basically, the Viet Cong we had to recognize as a legitimate political party, and we had to allow the presence of North Vietnamese troops in the southern part of the country. So basically, we got what Nixon in 73, what Nixon had proposed in 68. Again, why couldn't we have gotten this done faster? Why did it take an extra 4 years to reach this point? Again, part of a flawed policy based on flawed assumptions. The war continues without us until 1975, when the communists finally win. May 1st of 1975, the North Vietnamese began an all-out invasion of the South. Their military leaders, General Giap, thinks that this will probably take about a year to fully be successful before North Vietnamese troops work their way all the way down to Saigon. It takes less than a week. South Vietnam by now is so weak and so fragmented that there is no resistance to this North Vietnamese invasion. So by May 8th of 1975, South Vietnam now reverts to North Vietnamese control. And Ho Chi Minh unites the country into one communist faction. Now, it's at this point that we have to ask some interesting questions. Whoops. Let me ask you this one first. The protests at Kent State University were triggered by which of the following? Hint, the answer is not E. Ready? Let's see what the group says. The group says A, unanimously. Very good. The appearance that Nixon was increasing the scale of war activities rather than winding it down. Very good. Let me offer you a couple of conclusions here. First off, why did we lose? We followed a flawed policy based on flawed assumptions. We misread the situation, and instead of applying a political solution through diplomacy, we applied a military solution. You got to ask yourself, why do nations fight wars? And it's usually to gain an objective. But there was no real objective that the United States had to gain here. Again, there was no strategic significance to South Vietnam because Laos and Cambodia did fall to communist revolutions, but it didn't spread any further than that. And so our whole idea of the domino theory didn't really work out. It proved to be a flawed strategy, a flawed idea. We had nothing economically to gain there. They were never a big trading partner. They are today, but they weren't back then. And so we had no economic interest there as well. We fought this war 100% solely based on our ideals. It violated our ideals of a democratic, non-communist world. And while that's fine, that's not probably enough reason to go to war, simply because we don't like the situation. So why did we lose? Because we didn't win. Now that sounds simplistic, I know. How do you know when you've won a war? That's not a rhetorical question. How do you know when you've won a war? When somebody agrees to give up, when somebody admits defeat. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese never admitted defeat, and they were never going to. For them, this was a generational war. The guys, the South Vietnamese and North Vietnamese guys that were fighting us in the 60s and the 70s, their fathers were fighting the Japanese in the 40s. And their grandfathers were fighting the Chinese and the French before that. And these guys that were fighting us could easily envision their sons, their grandsons fighting somebody in the future to maintain an independent Vietnam. So for them, it was a generational struggle. And we Americans never think of wars like that. Our concept of war is go in, hit hard, get it over with, force a total surrender, and get out. Short, hard, and quick. But we couldn't do that this time because of the Cold War, because of the threat of nuclear proliferation in World War III. We lost because our enemy never conceded defeat. We lost because we never accomplished our goal. Our goal was an independent, non-communist South Vietnam, which did not happen once the United States left. The title for that last slide, A Decent Interval. Nixon and Kissinger and everybody else involved, the French, our European allies, the Russians, the Chinese, the North Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, everybody involved knew that South Vietnam would not be able to stand alone as an independent nation without U.S. backing. And once U.S. military backing was withdrawn, the nation finally collapsed. But it had to be a decent interval, a long enough period of time between our withdrawal and the inevitable collapse of South Vietnam so that we could disavow responsibility. A long enough period of time so that we could say, hey, and many of our veterans, if you ask them, they'll say, when I left, we were winning. And while I would have certain issues with that, in general, I would agree with them that we were at least maintaining an independent, non-communist South Vietnam. Once we left, that evaporated. So we fundamentally did not accomplish our goal, ergo we lost. Now, what lessons did we learn? This is a tough one because we're supposed to learn lessons from history, aren't we? But when we lose, how do we justify that? What do we learn from that? Well, the United States had to swallow a bitter pill here, and it still sticks in our throat. It still makes us choke sometimes. We had to realize that our power is limited, that even though we are the single most powerful nation on earth, we cannot always force things or manipulate things or influence things to our liking, that there are certain situations that we are powerless to deal with. A second lesson here is that any time that we do commit forces to combat, it must be done in the protection of national security, vital national security interests only. That just because we don't like a situation doesn't mean that the application of American military power is going to change that situation. And especially, do not commit young, brave Americans to combat, put them in harm's way, if we don't have clear goals and a clear method to achieve those goals. Another lesson that we learned here is that if you're going to put brave young Americans in combat, you should use sufficient forces to provide an overwhelming and decisive victory. And that if you can't have an overwhelming and decisive victory, then it's going to turn into a war of attrition. This is where you get people today talking about how Iraq and Afghanistan is another Vietnam. And while I have issues with that comparison, in general, I can see where they're coming from. It's a long, protracted engagement that we don't really seem to be making much progress with. That our presence and our efforts didn't seem to change things much. So if we're going to put troops in battle, give them the tools that they need and let them do their job. Leave war to the professionals, not to the politicians. We also learned here a very important lesson that foreign policy needs to have public support. Once public loses support for a particular policy, our government really is going to be ineffective in trying to follow that policy. And lastly here, what lessons did we learn? The use of force should always be our last resort. Try everything else first before use of force. And we're still learning lessons from Vietnam. These are just a few of them. Okay, that's actually all I've got for you today. So with your permission, we'll dismiss. All right. Chapter 30 is due tonight. Don't forget that. Tomorrow we'll come in and we'll talk about everything that's happened since 1975.